Now, the House Homeland Security Committee is scheduled to hold a hearing this morning on worldwide threats facing the U.S. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas and FBI Director Christopher Wray are both expected to testify. The hearing follows the recent resignation of President Biden's Customs and Border Protection chief. For more on this, let's bring in NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley. Julia, always great to have you with us. So first of all, what exactly are these worldwide threats that we're facing? You know, I mean, that sounds kind of scary. Walk us through this here. What are we expected to hear today from these two officials?
Well, if it's any comfort, Savannah, this has now become an annual thing. I don't know that that is comforting, but we have these worldwide threat hearings where we hear from the FBI and the Homeland Security Secretary. And in the past, what they've tried to describe is the landscape of threats. And they look at specific credible threats when the FBI launches an investigation. And DHS takes a more holistic approach where they're looking often at how to prevent someone or a group of people before they would take violent action. This is fallen under many different names throughout the past three administrations, but basically it's trying to prevent what they would consider domestic violent extremism. Of course, they'll talk about foreign threats, but really over the past decade, we've seen a pivot from our intelligence community as they focus less on a threat, or not necessarily they're focusing less, but they see a dwindling threat abroad from groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda and a growing threat at home from homegrown extremism. Some people who are often radicalized online, who have been triggered maybe by recent political events and may be extreme either on the right or the left. They may talk about some threats we've seen recently, for instance, before the midterms, when there were increased threats on election workers, people who think that election workers are trying to change votes and they were going to take physical action. Luckily, we didn't see a lot of that come through. But these are all things that they've been monitoring, and they'll talk about events going forward that they're also keeping an eye on.
Julia, as I just mentioned also a moment ago, and as you've, of course, reported, President Biden recently accepted the resignation of the Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Tell us what happened there.
Well, that was Chris Magnus, and there was actually a bit of back and forth about whether or not he would go. Over the weekend, we reported that Chris Magnus had been asked by Mayorkas to step down, but he was refusing to do so. In fact, he went to a border chiefs conference in El Paso, Texas, even though Mayorkas, the secretary, asked him not to go because he wanted him to resign. He did eventually hand in his resignation letter. And, Savannah, we should point out that we just got new border numbers late last night that show 230,000 immigrants were apprehended at the U.S. border last month, and that's a near record high, not quite the record we saw of 240,000 in June. But this is all coming as the focus really amped up on Magnus, who is not someone who came up through CBP, and people felt that he was starting to lose confidence. People were losing confidence in him.
Julia, quickly, before I let you go, let's just talk about what's next here. So say both Secretary Mayorkas and Director Wray lay out all these threats facing the U.S., some, as you mentioned, homegrown. What comes next? What sort of action could we see Congress, the administration, who take?
Well, one thing they might be asking for is more money, more programming to do those preventative measures. And that, of course, has taken many different forms. But they want to be able to do more research and to see what it is that radicalizes people. Often people who you speak to in this space who say they monitor, more than 20 fringe social media platforms, they think sometimes it's very hard to actually do anything to prevent that radicalization. But I'm sure we'll hear more about it today.
All right, Julia Ainsley, as always, thank you for your reporting.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.